Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She sat there silent, the only woman in a room of hardened faces and tired eyes. The screen behind the officer flickered with topographic maps, mountain lines, supply routes, enemy symbols, and yet her gaze was somewhere else entirely. She wasn't thinking about terrain or coordinates. She was thinking about the air, about how thin it would be up there again, about how each breath would feel like pulling smoke through broken glass. Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos had learned to keep her doubts to herself. They didn't want doubts. They wanted calm, capable, the one who always had an answer. That was her, the dependable one, the one they sent when no one else could make sense of chaos. 8 months into this deployment, the mountains had begun to feel like a living thing, a patient, indifferent predator. She respected them the way sailors respect the ocean, fear and love both at once. The terrain swallowed sounds, swallowed men. Some came back changed. Others didn't come back at all. This mission was supposed to be simple. A recon run. 15 kilometers from base. Observe, report, return. Routine words that never stayed routine for long. She'd done it before dozens of times. Every time the same ritual: tighten the boots, check the weapon, pack light, trust the team. She told herself this one would be no different, but somewhere deep inside, where instinct whispers louder than logic, she knew better. The morning came cold, the sun barely brushing the peaks when she laced up her boots. Each knot, each strap was part of the rhythm she lived by. Jackson was checking the comms again, muttering about signal interference. Chen packed her med kit, efficient and precise, eyes scanning everything twice. Rodriguez folded his map like it was sacred scripture. Williams adjusted the pack straps, somehow always carrying more than anyone else. And Thompson, the rookie, still looked like he couldn't quite believe he was out here. His uniform was too clean, his hands too still. He'd learn, they all did. Maria led them out as dawn painted the ridge gold. Their footsteps whispered against rock and dust. The mountain didn't care who they were, what flag they wore. It just watched, and she could feel it watching. Hours passed in silence. The kind of silence that pressed into your ears until your own heartbeat felt like noise. The air thinned with altitude, turning every breath into work. Maria kept scanning ahead, eyes tracing shadows for movement, hands steady even when her lungs burned. They reached the ridge by mid-morning. Below them, the valley opened wide, a scar of earth between mountains, stitched with a narrow dirt road. Abandoned structures dotted the landscape. Once, they might have been homes. Now they were skeletons, wood and stone stripped bare by war and weather. Maria lifted her binoculars. Nothing at first. Then movement, dust rising in a single thread at the far bend, trucks, slow, heavy, loaded. She counted 15 armed men, 3 vehicles. The kind of movement that wasn't supposed to be there. She signaled the team to hold position. Jackson set up the comms gear. Chen readied the camera. Routine, discipline, the illusion of control. They documented everything. License plates, weapons, markings. This was intelligence gold. The kind of data that got missions approved, the kind that justified months of waiting. And then, a sound small, insignificant, a rock rolling down the slope. It should have meant nothing, but the way Maria's stomach dropped told her everything. Every soldier learns the sound of luck breaking. Her head snapped up. One of the men below looked up, then another, and another. Maria saw the exact instant they were spotted. "Fall back," she shouted. The first shot cracked through the air before the echo of her voice even died. The ridge exploded into chaos, bullets shattering stone, dust rising in choking clouds. The team scattered. Training overrode fear. They moved fast, instinct guiding them to the fallback point they'd marked earlier. Maria ran last, her rifle heavy in her hands, her breath ragged in the thin air. Behind her came the sound of gunfire, the scream of ricochets, the terrifying silence between bursts. She threw herself behind a boulder, adrenaline pounding through her. One by one her team appeared. Jackson, Chen, Rodriguez, Williams, Thompson, all 6, alive. Relief came sharp and fleeting, just enough time to draw one steady breath before the first explosion hit. The blast tore through the ground like thunder, raining dirt and rock. Maria's ears rang, the world tilted. Someone was shouting, but she couldn't hear who. A grenade launcher. They were being flushed out. She gestured toward a narrow ravine, cover, darkness, escape. They moved as one, sprinting across open ground that felt like miles. Every heartbeat was borrowed time. Every step could have been the last. When the shadows finally swallowed them, the sound of pursuit faded, but Maria didn't stop. The ravine twisted and climbed, the air colder, the path tighter. Their breaths came in ragged bursts. She didn't think, she just led, the way she'd always done. They emerged hours or minutes later. It was impossible to tell. A small depression surrounded by boulders became their refuge. They collapsed in silence, gasping, coughing, alive. Jackson checked the radio, dead. The blast had killed it. They were cut off. 15 kilometers from base. No comms. Enemy in pursuit. Low supplies. And the mountains hungry. Maria gathered them close. Her voice was steady even when her hands weren't. We take the high route, night movement, hide by day, slow and quiet. No one argued. They trusted her because she'd earned it, because trust was all they had left. They rationed what little food they had, barely enough for one day. Water worse. 1 bottle per person, 2 if they stretched it dangerously thin. As dusk bled into night, they prepared to move. Maria stood watch while the others rested. The mountains grew colder, the stars so bright they almost hurt to look at. She thought about home, a small coastal town, her father's old boat creaking against the tide, her mother's voice telling her to eat more, to sleep more, to live less dangerously. She'd left that life because it was too small. She wanted something that mattered. But in moments like this, she wondered if maybe small wasn't so bad. When the last light faded, she woke her team. Let's move. They traveled in near silence, Rodriguez guiding by compass and stars. The ground was treacherous, loose stones, sudden drops, every sound carried, every mistake could be fatal. Maria's body screamed for rest, but she didn't let herself feel it. Pain meant she was still alive. Fear meant she still cared. Hours passed, 5 kilometers, maybe less. Time lost all meaning. When dawn began to stain the horizon, she called a halt. They found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff. The rock pressed heat into the air, turning their hiding spot into an oven by midday. Sleep came in fragments, broken by thirst and the memory of gunfire. Jackson spent the day bent over the radio, disassembling it piece by piece. He worked like a man clinging to hope with his hands. Maria watched him, knowing the odds were slim but unable to tell him to stop. Hope kept people alive longer than water sometimes. By the time the sun set again, exhaustion had stripped them all bare. They didn't talk about what might happen next. They didn't have the energy. They just moved. The second night was worse. The ground steeper, the air thinner. William slipped once, falling hard, sliding down a slope before Thompson caught him. For a moment they all froze, waiting for the echo of his fall to bring gunfire. But nothing came. Only the sound of William's laughing shakily, bleeding hands gripping rock. No one joined in. Maria crouched beside him, checked his wounds, pressed his shoulder gently. "You good?" He nodded. He wasn't, but he would be. They all would be. At dawn, they found a cave. Not deep, but dark enough to hide. For the first time in days, Maria let herself feel something close to relief. They were halfway home. If they kept pace, maybe 2 more nights. But hope is dangerous. It started as a faint thump in the distance. Rhythmic, mechanical, familiar. Helicopter. Maria froze. The sound grew louder. The cave walls vibrated. The air filled with dust. "Back," she whispered. "Stay still." They pressed into the shadows, holding their breath. The helicopter passed overhead, searching. It came back, again and again. By noon, they knew the truth. They were being hunted. The hours crawled, water dwindled, the cave stank of fear and stale air. Thompson began to shake, his skin pale, eyes unfocused. Chen knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Dehydration, altitude sickness, both. He tried to say he was fine, but his voice was a whisper. Maria watched, her heart sinking. Every decision she'd made was balancing on this moment. They couldn't stay, they couldn't move, and one of them was already slipping away. Rodriguez suggested splitting up. Jackson said no. Maria didn't say anything at first. She just looked at Thompson, barely 19, barely alive, and then at the rest of them. The helicopter came again, closer. The cave shook with its passing. Maria made the decision that would haunt her forever. We move tonight, all of us. If they stayed, they'd die. If they moved, maybe not all of them would. Chen gave Thompson something, a stimulant, temporary energy bought on borrowed time. He smiled weakly, told them he'd be fine. He was. 2 hours into the march, he collapsed. The world stopped. Chen dropped beside him, checking vitals, shouting his name. Nothing, then a pulse, faint, erratic. Maria's throat went dry. She wanted to scream, to cry, to undo every decision that had led here, but leaders don't get to break. She had to choose. Stay and die together. Or leave and maybe save some. She knelt beside Thompson, brushing the dirt from his hair, and made the call. They would leave him. It wasn't abandonment, it was math, it was mercy, it was hell. Chen refused to go. He needs medical care, I'm staying. Maria tried to argue, couldn't. She knew Chen was right. They built a small shelter from rocks, covered it with blankets, left most of their remaining supplies. Chen and Thompson would wait for rescue that might never come. Maria promised she'd be back. She swore it. When she turned to leave, she didn't look back, couldn't. The mountains swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Behind them, in that hollow of stone, a medic and a dying soldier faced the longest night of their lives. Ahead of them, 4 soldiers walked into uncertainty, hungry, exhausted, guilty. Maria led silent, her face unreadable, but inside something was breaking. She didn't know yet that this night would define her forever. That she would walk out of these mountains carrying more than just herself. She would carry every choice, every life, every ghost that called her name when she closed her eyes. And she would learn that survival isn't the same as coming home. How do you keep walking when every step feels like betrayal? Maria didn't know, she just did. One foot, then the next. The darkness pressed in close, cold air slicing through their breath. The mountains swallowed every sound except the scrape of boots and the quiet rattle of gear. No one spoke. Words would have been a mercy none of them deserved. Rodriguez led the way, compass glinting under starlight. Williams moved beside him, scanning the ridgelines with hollow eyes. Jackson brought up the rear, his radio, dead weight now, bouncing softly against his back. Maria stayed in the middle, the place of balance. The place where leaders walked when they had to protect everyone and trust no one to lead them home. Behind them, miles away, Chen was sitting in the dark with a dying man. Maria could almost feel it, like a string pulling at her chest. She imagined the sound of Chen's whispering, the way she'd count Thompson's breaths just to know he was still alive. The thought nearly broke her. But breaking wasn't an option. They climbed. Rocks slid under their boots. The cold was a living thing now, creeping under uniforms, biting skin raw. Every muscle screamed for rest. Maria's throat burned with thirst, her tongue thick and dry. When she swallowed, it felt like sandpaper. She kept her eyes on the horizon. 6 kilometers to safety, maybe 7. She repeated it like a prayer. At some point, William stumbled. He caught himself against a rock, gasping. "Water," he croaked. Maria passed him her canteen without a word. He drank, a single mouthful, then forced himself to hand it back. The gesture meant more than words. Rodriguez's voice came low. "We're close to the southern ridge. If we clear it before sunrise, we can make base by midday." Maria nodded. She didn't trust her voice to hold. The ridge was cruel, steeper than it looked, sharper, the kind of climb that made lungs feel like they were tearing open. They hauled themselves up by cracks in the rock, by the sheer will not to fall. Halfway up, a stone shifted beneath Jackson's boot and skidded down into darkness. All four froze. The sound bounced off canyon walls like an accusation. Silence followed, a long, heavy silence. Then a shout, distant, echoed. Enemy voices. Maria's heart stopped, then slammed back to life. "Move," she hissed. They scrambled the last stretch, hands bleeding, boots slipping. Bullets cracked against stone behind them. Someone fired a flare, lighting the night in harsh red. The color painted everything in blood. They reached the top and dove for cover behind a cluster of rocks. Bullets tore through the dirt where they'd just been. Maria returned fire, short, controlled bursts, more to buy seconds than to hit anything. Rodriguez joined in. Jackson, too. Williams reloaded with shaking hands, breath ragged. How the hell did they?" "Doesn't matter," Maria snapped. "We keep moving." They crawled along the ridge, using the rocks for cover. The gunfire faded, replaced by shouts. The enemy would climb after them. "Down that side," Rodriguez said, pointing to a slope that dropped into darkness. It looked impossible, it was, but impossible was all they had left. Maria went first, sliding, half falling, catching herself on sharp rock. The others followed. Dirt filled her mouth, tore her palms, ripped her sleeves. By the time they reached the bottom, every one of them was shaking. No pursuit, not yet, but the echo of voices still haunted the wind. They moved again, faster now, reckless. Fear had become their engine. When dawn began to rise, the mountains changed color, from black to gray, from gray to cruel light. Every shadow peeled away, leaving them exposed. Rodriguez called a halt. "We can't stay out in the open." Maria scanned the terrain, sparse cover, broken stone, and there, a dry riverbed cutting through the slope. She pointed. "There." They slid into it, huddled beneath an overhang. It wasn't shelter, but it was enough to disappear for a few hours. Maria checked them over. William's hands were torn open. Jackson's lip was split, blood dried down his chin. Rodriguez had a limp from a twisted ankle, and her own arms shaking, always shaking. She forced her voice steady. "We rest until nightfall. No fires, no light, just breathe." Jackson pulled the shattered radio from his pack and set it beside him. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "I keep thinking if I twist one more wire, it'll come back to life." "Then keep twisting," Williams muttered. "It's better than thinking." Maria smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. For a while they just sat in silence. The sun crept higher, heat pressing down, flies buzzing lazily in the still air. Maria leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come, only memories. Thompson's pale face, Chen's quiet determination, the way Chen's hand had squeezed hers before they'd left. "Bring him home." The words were still echoing. When night fell again, they moved. The pace was slower now. Jackson was limping from exhaustion, Williams breathing hard, Rodriguez's ankle worsening. Maria felt her own body failing, but she pushed harder, pulling them forward by sheer will. At one point, Jackson stumbled. She caught him. He tried to laugh, but it came out like a cough. "Sorry, boss." "Don't be," she said. "Just keep moving." They crossed a narrow pass where the rocks turned silver in the moonlight. The silence was eerie, too still, too quiet. Then a sound, soft, metallic. Maria froze, raised her hand. The others stopped. Voices again, below this time, flashlights flickering between boulders. The enemy was still hunting. They dropped flat to the ground, hearts hammering. The flashlights moved closer, sweeping arcs of light across the rocks. Maria held her breath. One beam passed inches from her boot. She didn't move, couldn't. A moment later, a shout in another language. Then the lights turned away, footsteps retreated. When they were finally gone, no one spoke for several minutes. Williams broke the silence. "We're ghosts," he whispered. "They can't find what's already dead." Maria didn't correct him. Part of her believed it too. By the time the first light appeared on the horizon, they had covered almost 8 kilometers. She didn't let them stop until she could see it, faint shapes against the sky. Towers, antennas. The base. She blinked hard, certain it was a mirage, but it was real. 2 hours, Rodriguez said hoarsely, maybe less. Maria nodded, though she felt nothing. Relief was too dangerous a luxury. They pushed on, every step heavier than the last. Her canteen was empty, her lips cracked and bleeding. The rifle weighed more than her own body. Then movement on the ridge ahead, figures armed. Her stomach dropped. Friend or enemy, there was no way to tell. She signaled for the others to take cover. They crouched behind stones, barely breathing. Through her scope, Maria studied the approaching patrol. Same gear, same posture, but the patches mud-streaked, barely visible. She aimed lower. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Then she saw it, a familiar gait, a limp, the way the man turned his head before speaking into his mic. "Sergeant Martinez." Her heart stuttered. "Friendlies," she whispered, "it's ours." For the first time in days, she let herself breathe. They stood. Maria raised her weapon high and called out. The patrol reacted instantly, rifles raised until recognition set in. Then came shouts, relief, hands reaching to pull them forward. Someone pressed a water bottle into her hands. She drank until it hurt. Voices everywhere, questions. "Where's the rest of your team? What happened out there? Are you injured?" Maria ignored them all. She found the patrol leader, grabbed his sleeve. "We left 2 behind, medic and wounded man. Coordinates," she recited them from memory, voice shaking. "You need a helicopter, now." He didn't hesitate. Already on the radio, already calling it in. The words "rescue operation" blurred in her ears. The world tilted. Adrenaline drained away, leaving her hollow. They were safe, or at least safer than they'd been. The walk back to base was a blur. Maria's body moved, but her mind was somewhere else, still in that cave, still hearing the echo of her own promise. When they reached the gates, she saw faces she knew, medics, officers, soldiers, but they all felt distant, unreal. She waved off the stretcher they offered. "I can walk." She didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. Inside the medical tent, lights burned too bright. The air smelled of disinfectant and metal. Someone took her rifle. Another slid an IV into her arm. She watched the clear liquid flow and felt shame for how grateful she was for it. She asked the only question that mattered. "Is the rescue bird airborne?" "Yes, ma'am," the medic said. "Already en route." Maria nodded. She closed her eyes, let exhaustion drag her under. When she woke, hours had passed. Her throat ached. Her head throbbed. The IV was gone. Rodriguez was sitting beside her, eyes red. "They found them," he said softly. She sat up too fast. "Alive." He smiled, small and broken. "Both." Her breath left her in a sob. She covered her face with her hands and cried, loud, unguarded, like she hadn't in years. They were alive, against all logic, all odds. Chen had kept Thompson breathing, and Maria's impossible promise hadn't been a lie. An hour later, the helicopter landed. The rotor wash blasted dust across the base and medics ran forward. Thompson came out first, pale, oxygen mask pressed to his face, but alive. Chen followed, walking on her own, eyes sunken but fierce. Maria met her halfway. Neither spoke. They just held each other, the kind of embrace born from hell survived together. The commander was already asking questions, already scheduling debriefs. Maria barely heard him. For now, nothing else mattered. They made it out. All of them. But as night fell over the base and engines quieted, Maria stood alone outside the infirmary, watching the mountains. They loomed dark against the stars, silent witnesses to everything she'd done. She knew the story wasn't over. Survival is never the end. It's only the beginning of what the mind still has to carry. And somewhere deep inside, Maria understood that though she had walked out of those mountains alive, a part of her had stayed behind, kneeling beside a dying soldier, whispering a promise into the dark. Why do some moments refuse to end, even when they're over? Maria sat in the medical tent long after the others had gone quiet, the hum of machines and soft beeping of monitors filling the silence. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, too clean, too sharp. Around her, her team rested in beds lined in neat rows. Rodriguez was already asleep, one arm hanging over the side. Williams sat awake but unmoving, staring at the wall as though it might speak. Jackson, always restless, lay with his hands folded over his chest, eyes open, unblinking. And then there was Thompson, hooked up to IV lines, chest rising and falling under a web of wires, alive but fragile. Chen hadn't left his side since the helicopter touched down. Her head rested against the bed frame, exhaustion carving deep lines into her face. Maria watched them all and wondered what it meant to survive something that should have killed you. Every few seconds the heart monitor beeped. Every few seconds it reminded her that for now, for tonight, they were all still breathing. The base commander came at dawn. He was tall, graying, his uniform crisp in the way of officers who didn't sleep outdoors anymore. He didn't ask for details, not yet. He just looked at her, really looked, and nodded once, as if acknowledging something words couldn't touch. "Rest," he said quietly. "Debriefing can wait." But rest wasn't possible. Sleep felt like falling, and Maria had done enough falling. She walked outside as the sun climbed over the mountains, painting the peaks gold. The light looked almost holy, but she couldn't feel it. Those mountains, they didn't look like freedom anymore. They looked like graves. The cold morning air stung her lungs. She stood there for a long time, arms crossed, watching the horizon until the tremor in her hands finally stopped. Inside the infirmary, a nurse offered food. She couldn't eat, tried, failed. Her stomach turned at the smell. Hours passed. The noise of the base went on, engines, radios, laughter from soldiers who hadn't seen what she'd seen. Then came the knock. The commander again, clipboard in hand. "Time for the debrief, petty officer." Maria followed him without a word. The briefing room was too bright, too sterile, the same kind of place where it had all started, a table, a map, too many eyes. But now she was the one at the center, not the listener, the survivor, the source. She recounted everything: the ambush, the retreat, the ravine, the dead radio, the endless march, the choice to leave Chen and Thompson behind. Her voice didn't shake, not once. She delivered it like a report, clean, controlled, every sentence a knife she had already learned how to hold without bleeding. When she finished, the room was quiet. An intelligence officer cleared his throat. "You realize, petty officer, that your actions technically violated standard operating protocol regarding personnel abandonment." Rodriguez tensed. Jackson looked ready to explode. Williams just stared. Maria didn't flinch. "If I hadn't made that call," she said, voice even, "you'd be debriefing corpses." The commander cut in before the officer could respond. "That's enough." He turned to Maria, eyes softer. "You brought your team home, that's what matters." The officer nodded reluctantly. "Understood." The rest of the debrief went on, maps marked, photographs analyzed, coordinates confirmed. The footage Maria had taken survived, somehow, despite everything. The intelligence it provided was invaluable. The ambush had been part of a much larger movement, and her documentation exposed it. Her suffering had bought them insight. Her pain had turned into someone else's strategy. When it was over, they were dismissed. Outside, Rodriguez clapped her shoulder. "You did right in there." I don't know if right exists anymore, she said quietly. He didn't argue, just nodded. Maybe not, but you did what needed doing. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. The camp was alive with noise, engines starting, rotors spinning, laughter echoing in the distance, but it all felt far away. She sat outside the medical wing, the same spot where she'd watched the mountains that morning. Only now the darkness made them disappear completely. She liked that better. Chen came out just after midnight. She looked thinner, pale in the floodlight. Her hands shook slightly as she lit a cigarette. She wasn't supposed to smoke near the infirmary, but Maria didn't stop her. For a while they said nothing, just breathed in the cold air. Finally Chen spoke, her voice cracked with exhaustion. I didn't think you'd make it. Maria turned to her. I didn't think you'd make it. Chen laughed softly, a broken sound, halfway between humor and grief. He stopped breathing twice. Thompson, I thought it was over. She exhaled smoke, eyes distant. When the helicopter came, I didn't believe it was real. I still don't. Maria watched her for a long moment. You saved him. Chen shook her head. You did. You didn't leave us behind, not really. Maria wanted to believe that, but she couldn't. Do you ever wonder, Chen asked quietly, why we were the ones who made it? Maria didn't answer. Because the truth was, she wondered that every second. A few days later, Thompson opened his eyes for the first time. The room filled with quiet celebration. Williams brought him a juice box like it was champagne. Jackson cracked a joke about him sleeping through the hardest part. Everyone laughed, too loud, too relieved. Maria stood by the doorway watching. When Thompson's eyes found hers, he smiled weakly. Told you I'd make it, ma'am. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, you did. He didn't see the tears she wiped away before turning to leave. The days stretched on. Medical evaluations, psychological assessments, the kind of bureaucratic routine meant to make sense of chaos. Maria followed orders, answered questions, endured therapy sessions with polite detachment. She said the right things, used the right words. I'm fine. I understand what happened. I've processed it. She lied beautifully. Because in truth, she wasn't sleeping. Every night she woke drenched in sweat, her mind dragging her back into those mountains. The sound of that first shot, the rock slipping under Thompson's boots, the silence after the decision. Sometimes she heard her name whispered in the dark, Chen's voice, or maybe her own. One night she dreamed she was still in the cave, watching herself leave. Only this time she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't stop it. When she woke, dawn had already broken. The sunlight felt like guilt. Rodriguez found her later that morning, sitting outside the canteen, untouched tray in front of her. You need to eat, he said. She shrugged. I'm not hungry. Yeah, none of us are. We do it anyway. He sat down beside her. You know, Williams says you're the only reason any of us are still here. Williams talks too much. Rodriguez smiled faintly. He's right, though. Maria stared at her hands. They didn't look like hers anymore, too scarred, too worn. Do you ever feel like we left part of ourselves up there? She asked. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Yeah, but that's what leadership is, isn't it? Leaving pieces behind so everyone else can come back whole. His words landed deep, because she knew he was right, and that was what made it hurt worse. That evening, the commander called her in again, not for reprimand, for something else. He closed the door behind her, the room empty except for them. You did well, he said simply, better than most could have. She met his gaze. We got lucky. He shook his head. Luck doesn't last that long, that was leadership. She didn't answer. He sighed softly. You're thinking about what you could have done differently. I left them, she said. I told myself it was tactical, but it felt like surrender. He leaned forward. When I was your age, I lost 2 soldiers to an IED. I replayed it for years. Every choice, every order, it never changes anything. but it eats you alive if you let it. Maria's eyes burned. How do you stop it? You don't, you just learn to live with it. The word stayed with her long after she left the office. That night she visited Thompson again. He was stronger now, sitting up, pale but smiling. He asked if she'd be joining them for dinner in the mess hall. She said maybe. When she stepped outside, the sky was clear. Stars scattered across the dark like fragments of broken glass. She tilted her head back and exhaled. For the first time since the ambush, she allowed herself to breathe without counting. Days turned into weeks. The team healed slowly. Chen began smiling again, small and hesitant. Williams returned to his old sarcasm. Jackson worked endlessly on equipment, determined to rebuild the broken radio for next time, he said. Maria found herself watching them more than talking. Seeing them alive was the only proof she had that she'd done something right. But when she was alone, when the camp fell quiet and only the hum of the generator filled the air, she still heard it. The silence of the mountains, the echo of her own orders. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she'd made a different choice. If she'd stayed. If she'd carried Thompson on her back and let herself die out there instead. But then she'd remember his face in the infirmary, alive, breathing, smiling. And maybe that was the answer. Maybe survival was its own kind of forgiveness. Weeks later, the official commendation came through. Medals, citations, recognition, words like heroism under fire and exemplary conduct. She accepted them quietly, the medal heavy in her hands. It felt cold, meaningless. After the ceremony, she found herself standing alone in the corridor, staring at the medal's dull shine. Rodriguez passed by, nodded. You do like it. It's not that, she said softly. It's just it's too clean. Nothing about what we did was clean. He smiled faintly. Then maybe it's not for us. Maybe it's for the ones who'll need to believe it was. She turned the medal over in her hand. Yeah, she murmured, maybe. Later that night, she wrote a letter she'd never send. It began simply. Dear Mom, I'm fine, don't worry, we made it back. Then she stopped, stared at the paper for a long time. What could she possibly write that would make sense of it? How could she explain the weight of decisions that had no right answers? In the end, she didn't try. She folded the page in half, tore it once down the middle, and let the pieces fall into the trash. Then she whispered to herself, a promise, a confession, maybe both. I'll carry it, all of it, so they don't have to. And she would. For the rest of her life. Why do the mountains still whisper when you're far away from them? Maria didn't know. She just knew she could still hear them, a low, endless hum at the edge of silence, like a sound that existed only inside her bones. It had been 3 weeks since the debriefing, 3 weeks since the rescue, since Thompson's breathing came back steady and Chen began to smile again. But inside Maria, nothing had gone still. The noise hadn't stopped. Every morning started the same way. Physical checks, a run she didn't need, a silence she didn't break. She kept her body busy because her mind refused to rest. The military was good at pretending time healed things. They gave her orders, schedules, assignment structure, as if discipline could fill the cracks that trauma left behind. It helped until it didn't. Her first day cleared for light duty, she stepped back into the armory. The smell of oil, metal, and gunpowder hit her like memory. Her hands moved automatically, checking a rifle, assembling it, cleaning it. The motions were second nature, comforting and mechanical. But when she looked at her reflection in the polished metal, she didn't recognize the eyes staring back. Someone knocked on the doorframe. Jackson, still limping slightly, radio tools strapped to his belt. They're assigning us a new training cycle, he said. Rodriguez says we'll get rookies. Rookies, Maria repeated quietly. The word felt heavier than it should have. Yeah, Jackson shrugged. Command wants us to teach survival protocol. Apparently, we're the example now. Maria let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That's a terrifying thought. Jackson smirked. Hey, could have been worse. They could have sent us back up there already. She froze for half a heartbeat before forcing her hands to move again. Yeah, could have been worse. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. That afternoon, they gathered in the training yard. 15 new recruits stood in formation, young, clean, full of noise. They looked like Thompson had looked on his first day, untouched, hopeful. Maria watched them, her expression unreadable. She should have felt proud, she thought. Should have felt something. Instead, all she felt was distance. "Ma'am," one of the recruits asked, breaking formation slightly, "what's the first rule when operating in hostile terrain?" She hesitated. The easy answer was textbook: maintain communication, know your roots, stay alert. But the truth that lived in her chest was different. "Don't assume you'll come back the same person," she said quietly, "but do everything you can to make sure everyone else does." The recruits looked at her, uncertain, curious. Jackson gave a small nod behind them, an almost imperceptible sign of support. She continued the lesson, voice calm, measured, but her mind kept drifting to the ridge, to the sound of gunfire echoing through stone. Later that evening, she found herself alone in the mess hall. Rodriguez sat across the room, maps spread in front of him. Williams and Chen were playing cards near the back, laughing softly, fragile but real. Maria stirred her coffee without drinking it. The spoon clinked against the metal cup, the only sound she could control. Rodriguez looked up. "You know, I think they're sending us out again soon." Her eyes lifted, back to the mountains. He nodded, different sector but same range. She stared down at the cup. "Figures. You'll be ready." She didn't answer. Readiness wasn't something she believed in anymore. It was a story soldiers told themselves so they could sleep. That night she dreamed again. The ridge, the shot, the fall. But this time when she turned to shout "fall back," no one moved. They just stared at her, eyes hollow, accusing. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat, her throat raw from a scream she hadn't realized she'd made. Chen was there in seconds, drawn by instinct more than sound. "You okay?" she whispered. Maria nodded, forcing her breathing to slow. "Just a dream." Chen sat beside her on the edge of the cot, still the same one. Maria didn't look at her, every time. For a while neither spoke. Then Chen said quietly, "It gets better, you know that, right?" Maria almost smiled. "Do you believe that?" Chen hesitated. "I have to." Maria looked at her friend, the one who had stayed behind in the dark and faced death without flinching, and realized that belief didn't come from faith. It came from defiance. The next morning, orders arrived. A new patrol, short range, low risk, a test. When Maria read the details, her pulse quickened. Coordinates, familiar ones, the same range that had nearly killed them. She went to the commander's office. "Sir, with respect, request reassignment, that sector." He cut her off gently. "I know where it is, and I know why you're asking, but we both know the only way to take back what the mountains took from you is to go back there." She stared at him. "You think it's that simple?" "No," he said, "but I think it's necessary." She didn't argue. 2 days later, she was back in the mountains. The same air, the same silence, the same indifferent beauty. Her new team was smaller, just 5 this time. Jackson, Rodriguez, Williams, Chen, and Maria, the old guard, the survivors. They moved through the terrain with practiced precision, each step measured, each word spare. It should have felt familiar. It didn't. It felt haunted. At one point, they stopped near a ridge that looked almost identical to the one where it had all begun. The wind howled low and soft, carrying sand that stung the skin. Rodriguez unfolded his map. "We're about 5 clicks from the observation point." Maria didn't answer right away. She was staring down the slope, the memory of gunfire echoing in the wind. Chen touched her arm. "You okay?" Maria nodded. Yeah, just déjà vu. They reached the ridge before sunset. The valley below stretched wide and quiet, empty, no smoke, no movement, just silence. Maria set up her binoculars. The glass trembled slightly in her hands. She steadied it. Nothing. Still, her chest tightened. The valley was too calm, too still. The way danger sometimes hides behind peace. "Ma'am," Jackson said softly, "orders." She lowered the binoculars. "We hold here, night observation only, no lights." They moved with quiet efficiency, setting up minimal cover, positioning themselves in the shadows. The routine was almost identical to that first mission. But this time, every small sound made her heart jump. When darkness fell, Maria sat apart from the others, rifle across her knees. The stars shimmered above, cold and unreachable. Chen joined her after a while, handing her a protein bar. "Dinner of champions." Maria took it, smiled faintly. "You ever think about leaving?" Chen shrugged. "Every day. But then I remember what it feels like to help someone make it home. It's addictive, I guess." Maria nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." They sat in silence, the kind that only people who have shared death can manage without breaking it. At some point, Rodriguez reported faint movement on the far slope, a figure, maybe two. Maria's pulse spiked. She took the binoculars again. A pair of shepherds, goats, nothing else. She exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for how tightly she'd been gripping the rifle. When morning came, she stood on the ridge alone while the others packed up. The valley looked softer now, bathed in early light. The same valley that had once been her hell. She crouched, touched the earth, cold, rough, familiar. "You didn't get me," she whispered. William's voice broke the silence. "What was that?" "Nothing," she said, standing. "Let's move." The mission ended uneventfully. No contact, no gunfire, just miles of walking and the soft hum of radio chatter. Back at base, the commander greeted them with a nod. "Good work." Maria handed over her report and turned to leave, but he stopped her. "How did it feel?" She thought about the valley, the silence, the ghosts that hadn't appeared. "Like breathing again," she said quietly. That night, for the first time in months, she slept through the dark without waking. When she opened her eyes at dawn, the sun was already breaking through the window, soft, golden, gentle. She lay there for a while, listening to the bass come alive. Rodriguez's laugh outside, Jackson arguing with a mechanic, Chen's voice somewhere in the distance, calm and steady. Normal, ordinary, beautiful. She got up, dressed, and stepped outside. The air was cool, clean. She walked toward the edge of the compound and looked out at the horizon, the faint outline of mountains in the far distance. For the first time, they didn't look like an enemy. They looked like part of her story, something that had burned her, shaped her, and still, somehow, set her free. Williams joined her, hands in his pockets. "You ever gonna tell us what you whispered out there?" Maria smiled. "Just told the mountains they lost." He laughed softly. "Guess they did." She looked toward the rising sun. "No," she said, "they taught me how to win differently." They stood there in silence, side by side, two survivors among many, staring at the world that had nearly erased them. Sometimes strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it just stands. And for Maria, standing there, breathing the same air that had once nearly killed her, it was enough. When people looked at her now, they saw something that wasn't there. They saw calm, confidence, a hero. But Maria knew better. Heroes were stories people told to make pain look like purpose. It had been 6 months since the mountains. 6 months since her team had walked through fire and come out the other side scarred but alive. The base had changed little, the same wind cutting through the tents, the same echo of boots on hard ground, the same smell of oil and dirt and iron. But Maria had changed completely. She could feel it in the way people saluted her, sharper, quicker, almost reverent. In the way command officers lowered their voices when she entered the room. In the way recruits whispered her name like it belonged to some legend. She didn't like it, because legends don't wake in the middle of the night gasping for air. They don't still taste dust when they breathe. But she wore the role anyway, because soldiers needed myths more than they needed truth. Her mornings began before dawn, as they always had. She would lace her boots in the dark, step into the cold air, and run until her lungs burned. Then she'd train the recruits, new faces, new voices, each one bright with the kind of faith she no longer had. She didn't teach tactics, she taught survival. She didn't teach how to win, she taught how to endure. Sometimes she caught them staring, the young ones curious about the scar on her hand, the hollow look in her eyes when the world went quiet. They'd heard pieces of the story, the ambush, the escape, the choice, the rescue. They filled in the blanks with heroics she never spoke about. One day, after a long morning drill, a young recruit named Ellis approached her. He couldn't have been older than 20. His uniform still smelled new, like fabric that hadn't seen dirt or fear yet. "Ma'am," he said, hesitant, "they told us you saved 6 people on your own." Maria looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Did they?" "Yes, ma'am," he hesitated. "Is it true?" She studied his face, the eager eyes, the belief glowing there. She could have told him the truth, that she hadn't saved anyone, that she just refused to stop walking when it felt easier to die, that she'd left 2 people behind in the dark and prayed the world would forgive her. But she didn't. She just said, "I did what I had to do." He nodded, satisfied, the myth intact. After he left, she sat down on the edge of the training field, elbows on her knees, staring at the dirt. She could still feel the weight of her rifle, the sting of the cold, the echo of gunfire in the mountains. "Why do they need me to be more than I am?" she whispered. "Because it gives them something to aim for," came a voice behind her. Rodriguez, same calm tone, same quiet understanding. He sat down beside her, uninvited but welcome. "They don't know what it costs to aim that high," she said. He nodded. "They don't have to, that's our job." She turned to look at him. "You ever get tired of carrying it?" He smiled faintly. "Every day, but it's lighter when I remember who I'm carrying it for." Maria nodded slowly. She understood. Because every time she saw Thompson walking again, every time she heard Chen's laugh echo across the base, it reminded her that pain could be worth it if it meant someone else got to live lighter. That night she found herself in the mess hall, sitting across from Chen and Thompson. Thompson still moved carefully, his body healing, his spirit tougher than ever. Chen's smile had returned, quieter but real. Williams joined them halfway through the meal, joking about rations, about the absurdity of how the coffee still managed to taste like mud. For the first time, Maria laughed, not out of politeness, not to fill silence, but because she meant it. It felt strange, that sound, soft, human. Later, Thompson said quietly, "You ever think about that night?" Maria's smile faded. "Every day." He nodded. "Me too. I used to be angry that you left us there, but now I get it. You didn't leave us. You gave us a chance." Maria's throat tightened. "It didn't feel like that at the time." "I know," he said, "but it was the right call. I'm here because of it." She didn't respond. Couldn't. She just reached across the table and squeezed his hand, the kind of gesture that didn't need words. Weeks later, the official commendations came through again. A ceremony this time. Cameras, commanders, speeches full of words like valor and sacrifice. Maria stood there, stiff in her uniform, while medals were pinned to her chest. The cameras flashed. Applause followed. All she could think was, "They're clapping for the wrong thing." After the ceremony, a journalist cornered her near the exit. "Petty Officer Santos, can you describe what it felt like to walk out of that valley?" Maria paused. The expected answer would have been simple: proud, relieved, grateful. Instead, she said softly, "It felt heavy." The reporter blinked, heavy. She nodded. Because when you walk out of hell, you don't come out empty-handed. You carry it with you. The man didn't understand. She could see it in his polite smile, the way he quickly turned to interview someone else. But her words stayed, quiet and unshakable like the truth itself. After the ceremony, she went to the range, alone. She lined up targets and fired until her shoulder ached, until the noise drowned out her thoughts. Jackson found her there an hour later, crouched beside her gear, reloading with methodical precision. "You know," he said gently, "you don't have to keep proving you belong here." Maria didn't look up. "I'm not proving anything." He gave a small laugh. "Yeah, you are. We all are, just in different ways." She sighed, lowered the rifle, and leaned against the wall. "They keep calling us heroes." "Yeah," he said, sitting beside her. "It's easier than calling us survivors." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of ghosts, of things they'd never stopped carrying. Months passed. The team settled into rhythm again, new missions, new routines, new recruits rotating through. Life continued in the strange way it always does after tragedy, pretending things were normal until the pretending became truth. Maria started mentoring recruits officially. The commander called it leadership development. She called it teaching people how not to die. She would gather them in the training yard, the dust rising under their boots, and tell them stories, not about heroism, but about humanity. "Out there," she'd say, "you won't always make the right decision. Sometimes there isn't one, but you'll have to make it anyway. That's what leadership is, doing something when doing nothing feels safer." Some recruits looked inspired, others looked frightened. Both reactions were right. One afternoon, she watched a young woman struggle with her rifle assembly. The recruit's hands shook, frustration welled in her eyes. Maria crouched beside her, guiding her movements. "Hey," she said softly, "you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be ready when it matters." The girl nodded, taking a deep breath, steadying herself. When she got it right, Maria smiled faintly. "There, see, not so hard." It wasn't about weapons, it was about belief. That night, Maria wrote in her logbook, not the official one, but the private one she kept folded inside her pack. She didn't write dates or ranks or reports. She wrote truths, small ones, hard ones. Leadership isn't glory. It's the weight of silence after a hard choice. Survival doesn't mean peace. It means learning to breathe through the guilt. Sometimes, bringing people home is the hardest part, because then you have to learn how to live again. When she finished, she closed the book and tucked it away. Chen found her sitting outside the barracks, the night air cool and still, writing again. "Something like that." Chen smiled. "You should publish those someday." Maria chuckled. "They're not stories people want to read." "Maybe not," Chen said, "but they're the ones people need to hear." Maria didn't answer. She looked up at the stars instead, the same stars that had once watched her crawl through the mountains, half dead and desperate. They looked softer now, less judgmental. "I used to think survival was the end," she said quietly, "that once we made it out, the story would stop hurting." Chen glanced at her. "And now?" "Now I think survival is just another mission, a harder one." Chen nodded. "And how's that mission going?" Maria smiled faintly, still walking. They sat together in silence, the kind that held more comfort than words. In the distance, the wind moved through the valley, the faint hum of the mountains, familiar and eternal. For a long time, Maria listened, and for the first time, the sound didn't feel like ghosts. It felt like memory, like belonging, like forgiveness. How many times can a place break you before it stops trying? Maria thought about that the moment she saw the new orders. The briefing room smelled the same as always: burnt coffee, old air conditioning, paper and ink. The commander slid the folder across the table without a word. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The coordinates were burned into her memory. The mountains again. Her eyes lingered on the man across from her. "Sir, this area was classified as unstable." "It still is," he said, "which is why we're sending you." Maria leaned back, jaw tight. "You want me to walk into the same range where half my team nearly died?" He met her gaze without flinching. "You know it better than anyone. You've survived there. We need someone who understands it." She let out a slow breath. "You think that's a qualification?" He folded his hands. "No, I think it's experience." The room fell silent. Somewhere outside, she heard the thud of a helicopter rotor starting up, the low, rhythmic sound that once meant salvation. Now it just sounded like inevitability. After a long pause, she nodded. "When do we leave?" 48 hours. 2 days. 2 days to prepare for the place that still haunted her sleep. That night she stood alone by the perimeter fence, the horizon fading into dusk. She could almost see the outline of those mountains in her mind, sharp, cold, waiting. Rodriguez approached quietly, as he always did. "You saw the orders." She nodded. He sighed. "They never let you rest, do they?" "Rest's not part of the job description." He smirked. "You could have refused." "Could I?" she said softly. "You think they'd send anyone else?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She turned toward him. "You in?" "Always," he said. The next morning, she found Jackson in the workshop, tinkering with a drone that had seen better days. "You heard?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, not looking up. "I was hoping the rumors were wrong." "They're not." He exhaled. "You want the same team?" "Yes." "Even Thompson?" She hesitated. "If he's cleared." Jackson looked at her. "You know he's still limping." "I know," she said quietly, "but I also know he won't forgive me if I leave him behind." When the orders were posted, the old team reassembled like a constellation finding its shape again. Rodriguez, Chen, Jackson, Williams, and Thompson. Each carried their own scars, their own ghosts, but when they stood together in that hangar, they looked whole again. "Déjà vu," Williams muttered, adjusting his gear. "Let's just make sure it ends differently," Chen replied. Maria checked her rifle, her voice steady. "We're not here to fight this time. Observation only. Collect data, confirm reports, get out, clean and simple." Rodriguez chuckled softly. "You say that every time." "Maybe one day it'll be true." The flight was quiet. The rhythmic thump of the rotors filled the space between them. Through the open side door, the landscape rolled out below, endless stretches of stone and shadow. Thompson stared down, his expression unreadable. "Never thought I'd see this place again." Maria glanced at him. "You don't have to like it, you just have to get through it." He smiled faintly. "That's what you said last time." She looked away. "Yeah, I did." When the helicopter touched down, the air felt thinner, colder. The moment her boots hit the ground, everything came rushing back. The smell of dust, the sting of the wind, the echo of silence. She took a breath, slow and deliberate. "All right, move out." The terrain hadn't changed. The rocks still jutted out like broken teeth, the ridges still swallowed sound, the valley still looked too quiet to trust. As they advanced, Maria felt the ghosts walking beside her. Every turn, every ledge, every shadow carried a memory. Rodriguez walked beside her. "Feels like coming home to a nightmare." "Maybe that's the point," she said. By late afternoon, they reached the observation point, the same ridge where everything had gone wrong years before. Only now, the scars of battle were gone. Nature had covered it all. Bullet holes hidden under moss, blood replaced by soil, pain buried under time. Maria crouched, scanning the valley through her scope. "No movement," she said. "Copy," Jackson replied, adjusting the drone controls. "Deploying in 30 seconds." The small machine lifted into the air with a soft hum. The others watched as it climbed high, its camera feeding live footage to their wrist monitors. Minutes passed, nothing, just empty land. Chen broke the silence. You ever think maybe the mountains aren't cursed, Maria? Maybe they're just indifferent. Maria lowered her scope. Indifference can still kill you. As dusk approached, Rodriguez reported faint heat signatures far side of the ridge. Small, sporadic, could have been wildlife, could have been something else. Maria felt that old tightness in her chest again, the same instinct that had saved them once before. Let's check it, she said. They moved slow, disciplined, the way only survivors do. The path narrowed into a crevice between two rock faces. Wind howled through it, cold and sharp. Every step echoed. At the far end, they found what looked like a collapsed shelter. Old, burned-out equipment half buried in dust. Rodriguez crouched beside it, not recent. Chen brushed aside some debris and froze. Maria, look. She lifted a fragment from the rubble, a piece of metal, weathered but recognizable. The same type of drone they'd lost on that first mission. Their drone. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Maria said quietly, "Guess we found our ghosts." They cataloged the wreckage, took samples, snapped photos. Routine, clinical, detached. But when Maria turned away from the site, her breath hitched. She could still see the flash of the ambush in her mind. The sound of her name shouted over static, the choice that had torn her apart. Chen's voice broke through. "You okay?" Maria nodded. "Yeah, just remembering." When they returned to camp, the night settled thick around them. Stars filled the sky, the same stars that had watched them crawl and bleed years ago. Williams brewed coffee over a small stove. Thompson sat with his legs stretched out, silent but alert. Rodriguez handed Maria a mug. "You ever think about what you'd say to your younger self, the one who stood here last time?" She stared into the fire. "I'd tell her she's going to make it, but she won't believe me." He chuckled softly. "You think she'd listen?" Maria shook her head. "No, but maybe she'd hear the tone." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need words. The crackle of the fire filled the space where memory used to hurt. At dawn, the mission was complete. They had what they came for: data, photos, coordinates. No contact, no casualties. Clean and simple, just like she'd promised. As they packed up, Maria took one last look at the ridge. For a moment, she imagined the figures of their younger selves still standing there, scared, determined, unfinished. She raised a hand in silent acknowledgement, then turned away. The flight back was lighter. The air felt easier to breathe. Even Thompson managed a joke about the coffee ration. Halfway home, Rodriguez leaned toward her. "You realize what you just did, right?" "What's that?" "You came back to the place that broke you and left it behind." Maria looked out the window. The mountains stretched below, vast, eternal, small from up here. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe I just stopped fighting it." When they landed, the commander was waiting on the tarmac. He looked at her, really looked, and smiled faintly. "You did well," he said. She nodded. "We all did." As the others dispersed, Maria lingered a moment, the wind whipping through her hair. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the peaks faded into the light. Maybe the mountains weren't her enemy anymore. Maybe they were a part of her, the part that had learned how to keep moving when everything else stopped. That night, as the base quieted, she sat at her desk and opened her journal. She wrote one line. "Some places break you, only so you can learn how to rebuild differently." Then she closed the book, leaned back and exhaled. For the first time, it didn't feel like she was carrying hell. It felt like she'd walked through it and left the door open for someone else to find their way home. When the orders stopped coming, Maria didn't know what to do with the silence. For years, her life had been measured in missions, countdowns, coordinates, debriefs. Now there was just stillness. The team had returned from the mountains 2 months ago. No ambush, no loss, no ghosts. Just work, clean and complete. They called it closure. But Maria knew better. Closure didn't exist. Only quiet did, and quiet could be worse. She sat alone in the armory one morning, staring at her reflection in the rifle scope. Not at the weapon, at the eyes behind it. They looked older, not by years but by distance. That was when the commander called her in. He didn't use the radio, he came himself. That never happened. "Walk with me," he said. They stepped out into the sunlight, that harsh, white kind that erased shadows. The base stretched around them, soldiers moving with purpose, machinery humming, life going on. "You've been here a long time," he began. "Longer than most stay." She nodded. "I know." He stopped, turned to face her. "We've been reviewing personnel for reassignment. There's a new civilian advisory position opening in training command, stateside, permanent." Maria blinked. "You're offering me a desk job." "I'm offering you peace," he said gently. "You've done your time, Santos. You've given more than anyone had a right to ask." She looked away. "And if I say no?" He shrugged. "Then you stay. We'll find a place for you. But sooner or later, you'll have to decide whether you want to keep living out here or start living again." She didn't answer. The wind carried the faint smell of diesel and dust. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed, a raw, bright sound that didn't belong in war. The commander put a hand on her shoulder. "Think about it. You've earned the right to." When he walked away, Maria stood frozen. Peace. It sounded beautiful and terrifying. That night she sat on her bunk, the transfer file open in her hands. Location: Virginia. Role: Tactical Advisor, Field Survival Program. Duration: indefinite. A new life, one without gunfire, without the smell of dirt and fear. One where she could sleep in a real bed, wear civilian clothes and walk outside without scanning rooftops. It sounded wrong. Rodriguez found her like that, still, silent, staring at the paper. He didn't ask, he just looked at her, then at the file. "So," he said softly, "they're offering you peace." She sighed. "That's what they're calling it." He sat beside her. "You thinking about taking it?" She hesitated. "I don't know, feels like running." He shook his head. "No, running is what you do when you're scared. Leaving is what you do when you've done enough." Maria looked at him. "And how do you know when that is?" He smiled faintly. "When the fight in you starts looking for something else." She thought about that long after he left. In the days that followed, she went through the motions, training, reports, maintenance. But everything felt different, quieter. Every task carried the question she couldn't shake. If not this, then what? Chen noticed. Of course she did. "You're distant," Chen said one afternoon. "I've always been distant." "Not like this, you're searching." Maria smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." Chen folded her arms. "You thinking about leaving?" "Maybe." Chen nodded slowly. "If you do, it's okay, we'll still be here." Maria tilted her head. "You wouldn't think less of me." "For what, choosing life?" Maria didn't answer. That night she found herself walking the perimeter, something she hadn't done since their last mission. The stars were sharp against the dark sky, scattered and unblinking. She remembered how she'd once prayed to them in the mountains, half dead, whispering promises into the wind. She promised she'd bring them home. She'd kept that promise. So why did it still feel like she owed the world something? She thought of the recruits, Ellis and the others, their young, unbroken faces looking to her for answers. What would they think if their so-called hero walked away? She closed her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what leaving would feel like. The quiet, the mornings without alarms, the laughter that wasn't forced. It didn't feel like weakness. It felt like healing. A week later, she was summoned again, not to the commander but to the training field. Rodriguez stood there, flanked by new recruits. "They wanted one last session before you go." "Who says I'm going?" she asked. He smirked. Your face says you already did. She exhaled through a small smile. Fine, one last lesson. The recruits gathered around, eager, nervous, respectful. Maria stood in front of them, her voice steady but soft. What I'm about to tell you isn't in any manual. They leaned in. In combat, you'll hear people say bravery is about not being afraid. That's wrong. Bravery is when you move anyway, even when your body tells you not to, even when your heart begs you to stop. She looked around, meeting their eyes. You'll think survival means victory. It doesn't. Survival means you'll have to live with the choices you made, and that's harder. She paused, the air heavy around her. But if you can walk out of hell and still find a reason to be kind, then you've already won. Silence followed. Then slow, one by one, the recruits nodded. Rodriguez caught her eye, pride and sadness mingling in his expression. You always did know how to end a story. Not this one, she said quietly. This one keeps going. That night she packed her gear. Not the medals, not the commendations. Just her worn-out boots, her logbook, and a folded photograph of her team. Williams found her in the hangar, tightening the straps on her pack. So it's real, huh? She nodded. You'll hate the desk job, he said. I know. He smiled. Good, hate it for a while, then get used to it. Take care of them, she said. I always do. As she walked toward the transport helicopter, she felt the eyes of the base on her. Salutes, waves, quiet nods of respect. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone learning how to breathe again. The flight was smooth. The sky stretched open, endless blue. She looked out the window and watched the land unfold beneath her, valleys, rivers, roads. Every line told a story. When she landed, there was no ceremony, just silence and the smell of rain. Virginia was green, too green. The air was thick with life. It felt strange to be somewhere that wasn't defined by dust. Her first morning at the training facility, she woke before dawn out of habit. The air was cool, the world quiet. For a moment, she almost expected to hear rotors or radio chatter. Instead, there were birds, just birds. She stood by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that didn't taste like mud. And for the first time in years, she smiled. In the weeks that followed, she adjusted slowly. She trained recruits in safe fields, watched them stumble through drills, saw herself in their awkwardness. Sometimes they asked about her past. Sometimes she answered. Most of the time she didn't have to. They could see it in her eyes. She spent evenings walking the base perimeter, not because she had to, but because she liked the quiet. The sunsets here were soft, golden, forgiving. One evening, she opened her old journal. The pages were worn, the ink smudged from years of sweat and dirt. She wrote one new line. Peace isn't the absence of battle, it's learning how to live after it. She closed the book, exhaled, and let the sound of crickets fill the space where memory used to ache. But even in peace, she carried her past with her, not as a wound but as a compass. When new trainees asked why she'd stayed in the military at all, she said, "Because the uniform is what broke me. It's what taught me who I was when I thought I was nothing." One night a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the windows and rain poured in sheets. She stood outside, soaked, eyes closed, face turned toward the sky. For a moment the sound of rain became the sound of the mountains again, wind and grit and silence. But this time it didn't scare her. This time it sounded like home. She whispered into the storm, barely audible. I made it out. And then softer still. Thank you. Because somewhere deep inside her, she finally understood survival had never been about strength. It had been about grace. The next morning she woke to sunlight streaming through the window. A new day, ordinary, beautiful. She smiled, not the tight, guarded smile of a soldier, but something lighter, human. She wasn't walking out of hell anymore. She was walking into life. How long does it take to stop hearing the war in your sleep? Maria still didn't know. Years had passed since the mountains. The scars on her hands had faded, but the ones inside had simply learned how to live quieter. The world had moved on, new conflicts, new soldiers, new stories. And somehow she was still here. She lived on the coast now, not far from the sea, the kind of place where wind carried salt instead of dust, and the sky seemed too blue to be real. Her mornings began with coffee on the porch and the sound of waves against the rocks. There was peace here, not the kind people talked about in ceremonies, the real kind. The kind that asked for nothing and gave nothing back except stillness. She still worked with veterans, younger faces now, most of them carrying ghosts of their own. She didn't wear the uniform anymore, but she didn't need it. They listened to her anyway. Some came angry, some broken, some too quiet for their own good. Maria didn't give speeches, she just listened. Sometimes that was enough. She kept a small office in town. On the wall hung a single photograph, her old team taken years ago. Chen, Williams, Rodriguez, Jackson, Thompson. Their smiles were tired but real. She never told anyone what happened to them after. Some stories didn't belong to her anymore. One afternoon, as the tide rolled in, she got a letter. Not an email, a real letter, handwriting uneven, the paper folded twice. It was from Ellis, the young recruit from her last posting. "Ma'am, you probably don't remember me, but I was in your training class. I wanted to say thank you. I'm out now, started teaching. You once told us that survival means living with your choices. You were right. It's hard sometimes, but I'm trying. I guess what I wanted to say is I made it out too." She sat there for a long time after reading it, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Then she smiled, that small private smile that carried both sorrow and pride. "I'm glad," she whispered. "I really am." She placed the letter in her journal, the same one she'd carried through every storm, every mountain, every sleepless night. The pages were fragile now, yellowed at the edges. She flipped through them slowly, reading pieces she didn't even remember writing. Some places break you, only so you can learn how to rebuild differently. Peace isn't the absence of battle, it's learning how to live after it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Her own words, but they didn't feel like hers anymore. They felt older, wiser, like they belonged to the version of her who had once walked through hell and refused to stop. That evening she walked down to the shoreline. The wind was cool, the horizon endless. She stood barefoot in the sand, waves brushing her ankles, the ocean breathing around her. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the wind sounded like the mountains again, low, distant, unending. But this time it didn't feel like a memory. It felt like forgiveness. A few weeks later, she received an invitation from the Department of Defense. It was formal, embossed, stamped with insignia. Recognition ceremony for service and valor. Petty Officer Maria Santos. She almost laughed. It had been years, decades maybe. They were still writing her story, long after she'd stopped needing them to. She didn't want to go, but something, maybe duty, maybe closure, told her she should. The ceremony was held in Washington, a sea of uniforms and medals and speeches, faces she didn't know, shaking her hand, thanking her for sacrifices they couldn't comprehend. She smiled politely, nodded when expected, listened to the words that no longer belonged to her. When they called her name, she stepped up to the stage. Applause filled the room, loud, bright, hollow. She took the medal, held it for a moment, then looked out across the audience. Rows of faces, young soldiers, old officers, civilians who wanted to believe in heroism. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "I used to think survival was about strength," she began. "That the ones who made it through were the ones who fought the hardest, but that's not true." The room fell silent. Survival isn't about strength. It's about grace. It's about holding on long enough to forgive yourself for the things you had to do, for the choices that don't stop echoing. She paused, the weight of the years pressing gently on her shoulders. I didn't walk out of that valley because I was brave. I walked out because I had to, because someone had to carry the story home. And maybe that's what survival really means, carrying something for those who couldn't. She looked down at the medal in her hand. I'll keep this, not because I earned it, but because they did. She left the stage without waiting for applause. Outside, the sun was setting, soft light spilling over the steps, painting everything gold. She stood there alone, breathing it in. Rodriguez would have laughed, she thought. Chen would have told her to stop being so serious. Thompson would have said she sounded like a preacher. She smiled at the thought, maybe I do. A young soldier approached her hesitantly, his uniform crisp, eyes wide. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say my mom used to talk about you, said you were the reason she joined." Maria blinked. "Your mom?" "Yes, ma'am, Sergeant Avery Thompson." For a second she couldn't speak. Thompson's daughter. She swallowed the ache in her throat. She was one of the best. "I know," the young man said. "She used to say you taught her what it meant to come home." Maria nodded slowly, her eyes stinging. "She taught me that too." He saluted. She returned it crisp, silent, perfect. When he walked away, she sat on the steps and watched the sky fade from gold to gray. The wind rustled the flag overhead. And in that moment, Maria realized something she'd never dared to believe before. She hadn't just survived the war. She outlived it. That night back at her small coastal home, she lit a candle by the window. A quiet ritual she'd carried for years. One flame for the ones who didn't make it. As it flickered, she whispered each name softly into the air. Rodriguez, Williams, Chen, Jackson, Thompson. And then finally, Maria. Not as a soldier. Not as a survivor. Just as a person. She let the candle burn until the wax melted low, then blew it out. Smoke curled upward, thin, fleeting, beautiful. She stood by the window, watching the dark roll in over the ocean. The wind whispered against the glass, the same way it had whispered through the mountains so long ago. She could almost hear the echo of her own younger voice, tired, defiant, unbroken. "You didn't get me." And she smiled because it was true. The next morning she woke before dawn, as she always did. The horizon was pale and endless. The ocean breathed slow and steady, like the world itself had finally exhaled. She brewed her coffee, stepped outside and sat on the porch. For a long time she just listened to the birds, the waves, the faint hum of life moving on. And then she whispered softly, almost to herself. Sometimes survival isn't about walking away. It's about walking back to the places, the memories, the people you lost, and realizing you can finally forgive them. Forgive yourself. She took a sip of her coffee, the steam rising in the cool air. "Sometimes," she said, smiling faintly, "dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The wind caught her hair, carrying the words out over the sea, a whisper too small for the world, but just loud enough for the ghosts who still listened. And then she fell silent again. Not out of pain, not out of grief, but because silence was finally just silence, not memory, not fear. Peace had stopped being a place. It had become her.